Welcome to Building Tomorrow, a podcast about the ways tech and innovation are making the world a better place. I'm your host, Paul Matzko, and if there is one phase of life all but guaranteed to make you realize just how out of your depth you are, it is parenting. You're barraged with dozens of decisions, from whether to swaddle, to sleep train, to breastfeed, and so on, and you have to decide what to do now, all while in a sleep-deprived state. And the consequences of choosing poorly seem so vast. It's 2 a.m., your 2-year-old is struggling to draw a breath, you take them in the shower, steam it up to help them breathe, but you're faced with a decision. Do you rush them to the emergency room because it's actually a life-threatening complication of a serious illness? Or is it just a bad case of croup and you'll feel stupid for overreacting in 15 minutes when it resolves? How do you know? Parenting is a constant churn between sheer delight, mind-numbing tedium, and existential dread. Our guest today has a better way that we can approach these kinds of decisions. Dr. Emily Oster is a professor of economics at Brown University and the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, the latest of which is Crib Sheet, a data-driven guide to better, more relaxed parenting from birth to preschool. Welcome to the show, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
So to start, Emily, can you pick a topic? Walk us through the mental thought process that you encourage parents to go through when encountering a parenting decision.
So let's take something sort of simple like swaddling, which, there are people who will tell you like swaddling is super important and helps your kid sleep. And then there are people who will tell you like, no, actually you can't swaddle because it will ruin your kid's hips, or some other thing, or it's not nice to them or something else. So what I suggest parents do is sort of a 2-step thing. First, really look at what the data says. And so in the case of something like swaddling, what I do in the book is really go through does swaddling actually seem to improve sleep? How good is our evidence on that? And in that case, the answer is yes, and that our evidence actually pretty good, partly because it's easy to watch the same baby swaddled and not swaddled and to get a sense of why they sleep better and whether they sleep better. And then, once you have that data and you kind of really know what are the benefits and what are the risks, which in that case are basically there are no risks, then think about making a choice that works for you. Now, in something like swaddling, it's not super complicated in the sense that once you see the data, it tells you kind of this is something that's going to help your kid sleep better, and it doesn't have any downsides. So on the one hand, it's not like you have to swaddle. On the other hand, it's probably a good idea. But then there are a bunch of other things in the book, including some much more fraught topics like sleep position, like do you co-sleep with your baby, where I think it's more, the evidence is more mixed. And once you see the data, then you really want to think about, where are my family's preferences? I have to combine this data with some understanding of what's important to us and what are the kinds of risks that we are comfortable taking to make a decision that works for us. And what that means is that for a lot of these things, the same data is not gonna lead families all to the same decisions.
One thing I appreciate about your book is this sense of, we need good data, and better information will help us make better informed decisions. But there's variables that are going to be different from person to person, like you mentioned, family preferences. And I really appreciated that approach, that there's not necessarily one hard and fast rule on some of these issues. I mean, there's some where the data is a little more overwhelming, where the downsides are so slim and the upsides so large that it's hard to imagine it not being a good decision for most people. But that ambiguity, I think, was useful after surveying my own share of parenting books, where there's lots of "thus saith the parenting expert," right?
Yeah, and I think that attitude, sort of there is a right way to do it, and it is this, and it is the right way for everybody, is part of, I think, what makes some of these parenting stuff so anxiety provoking, because people are so sure that they are right, and that they are so right that it must be the right choice for everybody. And so then when they come to, people come to give you advice, it's not like, hey, this is what worked for me, you might try it, but this is what you have to do, because if you don't do this, you're going to make a terrible choice, and then your baby is going to suffer.
Your baby's like one of those Romanian orphanage children. You're scarring them for life.
You're scarring them for life by everything. Basically, everything you do could scar them for life, or if you do the other thing, it also could scar them for life. There's no winning.
Yeah, it leads to kind of paralysis to some extent. Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, I did have a question. So why does it feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm off base with the presumption, but it does feel like information behind a lot of these parenting decisions is relatively inaccessible and not as well distributed in the population as information is the kind of baseline information in other domains. So like, is it worse, and why is it worse than, say, learning how to manage your finances?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's a few things. One is that the data is sort of not the data is often not as good. It's the kinds of information that we want, the kinds of data that we want here, really require people to make different choices with their kids, so we can compare them and see different things about them.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say the same thing about finances, like to see if it's a good idea to invest in index funds. We need to see like some people who invest in index funds, people who don't. But there's
Mm-hmm.
actually also some like raw truth there, which is just like, what if you had invested in index funds? There's like an actual answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in this case, parents make different choices. It isn't always so easy to infer from the data what actually is the truth. And I think that kind of the fact that we're really dealing with behavior and not just the kind of behavior of financial markets,
Mm-hmm.
that's part of what makes these data so challenging.
Okay, so now I'm going to get you to help us think like economists when it comes to parenting. And you're actually quite good about not overlading the book with jargon, but there are a few things I want you to walk us through. So in the book, you talked about thinking through constrained optimization. What is that, and how does thinking like an economist about that help someone approach the trade-offs involved in parenting?
So when we do economics and we sort of think about people, our base idea is that people are optimizing, so that they are trying to make choices about their behaviors or about their purchases that are going to make them like as happy as possible. That's their goal. But we almost always give our people some constraints, right? So on the one hand, like, I want you to be as happy as possible, but you have a budget. So even though the thing that would make you as happy as possible is to own like 6 Gulfstream jets,
Yes, please.
actually, you can't have that. And so really, we're going to give you some amount of money, and then we're going to think about your choices in that. Maybe you only get one jet, or maybe could be no jets, could be none. So this idea that people are making sort of optimal choices under constraints, that's kind of a key underlying principle of economics.
Mm-hmm.
We think about it applied to parenting. I think we sometimes will sort of frame things as like, how do I optimize? Like, how do I do everything the best? What is like the sort of most safe, best? I should be both engaging in play with my kids at every moment, reading to
Mm-hmm.
them at every moment. Also, I should boil all the water to make their formula. Also, by the way, you shouldn't make formula. You should just breastfeed. Also, you should pump all day at work. Also, you should, your kid should sleep in exactly the right way, even though, even if that means you never sleep. And I think that a lot of that discussion ignores the idea that people face constraints, that there's a limited number of hours in a day, that you can't actually do all of those things if you literally haven't slept at all. And so some of what I talk about in the book is sort of about sort of thinking about, okay, there are some constraints, and you're not going to be able to do all of these different things in exactly the way that everybody says that you should do them, and you may have to pick which of these things are most important. And that's where I think the data can be super helpful, because a lot of our recommendations do not come with with information about like how important is it to do one thing versus the other.
Mm-hmm.
Once you have that information, it's easier to say, okay, with the constrained time and there's constrained attention and constrained money that I have, what are the best choices that I can make?
Okay, so our choices are constrained. We're all facing trade-offs, and maybe the choice isn't between me playing with my kid or that kid watching an iPad. I mean, that it's not like one's replacing the other. I have to get ready for work. My kid has to do something. So
Yeah, or even something, I mean, in that example, it's like maybe the choice is like, the only way for me to be able to make dinner is for my kid to watch a half an hour of TV, because I can't actually cook with my kid like crawling all over me.
Mm-hmm.
So I could order takeout, and then I could not have them watch the iPad, or I could make dinner and they could watch the iPad.
Yep.
But you've told me both it's very important to have healthy home cooked food and that my kid cannot watch the iPad. I literally cannot do both of those things. And there's like, and so that's it. You have to choose one of those things. And I think we often don't recognize that you may have to make a choice.
Now, So I get constraint optimization. There's another term you throw in it later on in the book about thinking like a Bayesian versus I think it was a frequentist. But what does it mean to make parenting decisions like a Bayesian?
So, so I talk about this in the context of TV, but I think it actually comes up a lot. So there are different ways to incorporate data into like what you think is a conclusion about some relationship. So the example I give is about SpongeBob and reading. So let's say that there is a new study that comes out that says that watching SpongeBob SquarePants helps kids learn to read when they're very young.
Mhm.
Let's say that's the only evidence we have. There's amazingly only one study in my imaginary world that has been run on that important question.
It's very
And
specific, that one study.
very specific, very specific. And let's say, it shows big effects. If you're what we call a frequentist, somebody who basically is going to use only the data that we have to draw conclusions, you would kind of be forced to conclude that SpongeBob teaches kids to read. If you're a Bayesian, you want to take that data, but combine it with what we call your prior, with some baseline belief about the relationship.
Mhm.
And in that example, you probably do not think it is very likely that SpongeBob is going to affect kids' early reading. So it's true that like when you find some new data that shows that it does, you should move your prior a little bit. It should change your beliefs a little bit. But since your beliefs are already so strong in the direction of that cannot possibly be true,
Hmm.
when you move your beliefs a little bit, you probably still don't think it's true. And so, I talk about this in the context of like sort of thinking about evidence on screen time, where unfortunately the actual evidence that we have is very limited. And I use this as a frame for sort of how can you conceptualize what is likely to be true? Like, what are your priors about what is likely to be true, and that may help us think about that choice. And in particular, your prior is probably that like watching 9 hours of TV a day is not good for your kid.
Mhm.
Watching, like spending 20 minutes on an iPad 3 times a week is almost certainly fine.
Mhm.
And so, of course, like it would be great to have data about those, but actually our priors are pretty strong in those cases. And then there's some space in the middle, like is an hour of TV too much? What about 2 hours? Where really it would be great to have more data, because I think that our beliefs are kind of mixed on that, and it's hard to know what the answer is. And so we could benefit more from more data.
So you've written first here about pregnancy and then parenting, and that makes me wonder how that shifted how you think of human rationality. And here I want, if you could touch on the divide between like classical economists and behavioral economists. And it's an easy distinction to overstate, but there can be a distinction between this emphasis on people as either rational or irrational actors. And I think both you and your partner are economists. Your parents were economists, and I think at least one of you has behavioral economics training. So, has this experience of writing these books of parenting changed your view of human rationality?
That's interesting. So, I mean, just to like sort of give a little bit of kind of how I see the background, a little bit of this behavioral stuff. I mean, when I was in graduate school, or really like late in college, and like the sort of like 2001 kind of space,
Mm-hmm.
there I would go to there was like a very clear idea, like behavioral economics was like something that was very separate from, it was like a kind of economics, where like we were like moving away from the idea that people were totally rational. And it was like a really like there was a behavioral seminar in grad
Mm-hmm.
school, and like there were people like doing that as their field. And I think part of the like tremendous success of behavioral economics over the period since then is that that I'm not like, people do sort of think of it as a field, but not in the same kind of like very separate way.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of people whose work sort of touches on behavioral economics, or tries to use ideas from that to think about data, or to interpret the things that we're seeing in the data. And so I think I think those distinctions have blurred a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I think we've gotten more comfortable with the idea of sort of thinking about people as kind of as non-rational, and with really trying to focus in on the places where they're so non-rational that it really changes the things we see in the data, as opposed to, everybody's a little non-rational, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But sometimes it's not quantitatively important. When I think about parenting, I do think there's an experience when you're a parent, which is, it's kind of like inherently inherently not rational, like and inherently just like you kind of can't believe how much you care about this thing, and also how difficult it is um to make choices that you even choices you kind of know are right.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's just like very difficult to do that, when they are hard. And I even, and even things like sort of your like the investing now for benefits later, I find actually very difficult in parenting. I think a lot of people do. It's very easy to be like, oh, I'm just gonna like give into whining right now. But I think it also reinforces like some of the sort of key principles of economics, like incentives matter,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Like you kind of know, it's easier right now to give in to the whining, but then deal with it later. That's kind of like what we'd say like present bias. Like I don't, I'm discounting the future. On the other hand, it's like such a crisp illustration of the idea that like if you indicate if you provide your kid an incentive to whine by giving in to them, they will definitely whine more. So kids are like a good illustration of economics for sure.
For our listeners who haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the differences between double blind studies and observational studies, et cetera, can you tease out some of the distinctions that you make in the book when it comes to evaluating the evidence? So you've got different kinds of trials, different kinds of studies, and you've also got the issue of correlation versus causation. So unpack some of that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, in all of these places, what the thing we are trying to aim for is an understanding of like, if I do X, will Y happen, right? So is there a causal relationship between this thing that I'm going to do with my kid and some outcome that I care about?
Hmm.
And there are different ways you can study that. And so the kind of best way, the most causal, wonderful way that we all love is some kind of randomized controlled trial, which would work by, taking parents and kind of randomly having some of them do one thing and some of them do another thing, and then comparing the outcomes.
Hmm.
And if you've chosen who does what randomly, then any differences in outcomes you can attribute to the treatment. Um, and there are some things where we can study them that way, in parenting. There are not a lot of things like that, and I think you can sort of see why that would be. It is because people do not like to experiment with their baby. So we have so there are a lot of cases where all of our evidence is going to be from what we would call observational data, where people make different choices, and then you compare the outcomes for the people who make one choice, the people who make the other choice. And that's like, there's those sort of fundamental like correlation versus causation problem with those studies, which is that the people who make one choice are different from the people who make another choice. And as the choices get like in some sense more and more important to people, that may be more and more true.
Mm.
So in something like breastfeeding, like the differences between people who choose to breastfeed and people who don't are enormous. They're like really, really big. Women who breastfeed tend to be more educated, tend to be richer, more likely to be married, more likely to be white. Like there's tons of differences between these groups, many of which also relate to the other kinds of outcomes we're interested in
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
studying. And so one of the things that I think I do much more in this book than maybe would be true if I were not an economist is to say, okay, within that category of observational studies, there are some which are better and some which are worse, related to the question of how good a job they do at adjusting for these differences across people. So in the case of something like breastfeeding, like you have some observational studies where we just kind of compare the two groups, and maybe we adjust for differences in the education of the mother,
Mm.
or differences in her age and her education, and that's kind of it. And then you have other studies where we compare siblings, where one sibling is breastfed and one sibling is not. And so it's true, those are both observational studies. They both, are not randomized, but it's a lot better if you can compare two kids with the same mom who were different, one of whom was breastfed, one of whom was not, to comparing two kids of totally different moms, right? Like, how worried are you about differences? Like, sure, there are probably some differences. Why was one kid breastfed and one was not? That's like a good question, but that's much, much closer to the kind of experiment that you want to run than the just, controlling for a couple of things. And so a lot of the kind of work of the book really is within this very broad category of studies, trying to isolate the ones that do a better job of separating out correlation and causality in places where we simply do not have randomization, and where probably we will never have like really good randomized data.
So now we've laid some of the kind of structural backbone of the book, and the economics-based thinking and data-driven thinking behind it. A few specific questions about some of the content. So we're a tech and innovation-focused podcast. Is there, if you had to, under coercion, pick one area that you studied while writing the book that you think would be most potentially productive for technological innovation to dramatically improve outcomes? If we threw venture capital money and the smartest engineers in the country in Silicon Valley at it, what would be that area?
I mean, I harp a little bit in the book on like breastfeeding technologies, and particularly pumping technology, which is very poor and very annoying. And we've had some innovation in like hands-free pumping, but even in things like just storing, cleaning, like the kind of mechanisms that go into like making that work, it's like incredibly complicated and annoying. And so that is a place where I think we could use more tech. I'm trying to think of what else. I mean, everybody's always sort of talking about different kinds of things about baby sleep, although I'm not sure that that technology is so well suited to helping your baby sleep. I guess there's the snoo.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how to comment on that. So I'm going to go with breastfeeding as being like a big thing. Oh, and the other thing is, about a quarter of kids are like don't poop in the potty.
Really?
Getting back to our discussion of are potty trained for urination long before bowel movements, and it's like, of course, there's a name for it. It's called stool toileting refusal. And so if there's some technological way to like improve kids' willingness to use the toilet, that'd be awesome.
Did you come across a convincing explanation while you're researching these topics for why both infant and maternal mortality rates are so much higher in the U.S. relative to other developed countries?
So, I mean, the question of infant mortality is something that I've actually worked on in my academic work, and I think I'm not sure we have so much of an answer, but I think that that one of the things that we sort of pulled out when we looked at the data comparing the U.S. to some places in Europe is that the issues in the U.S. seem to arise in the second, like in the kind of period from like a month to a year. So we often separate infant mortality into neonatal mortality, so it's the first 28 days, and post-neonatal mortality, which is the period from a month to 1 year. And the U.S. actually pretty good in the first month in terms of actually having fairly low neonatal mortality, particularly relative to the birth weight. So actually, like, the U.S. is a pretty good place to have a low birth weight baby in terms of how they do. But then in this period from a month to a year, we see huge differences open up between the U.S. and other places, particularly among poor families. So that kind of suggests that there's something about the support that we're giving people, not in the hospital, but at home, that must be contributing to this. But that doesn't give us an answer. And maternal mortality is something that I haven't studied that specifically. My guess is that some of the same demographic issues are gonna crop up. Maternal mortality is high in the U.S., although still fairly still quite
In
rare.
historical terms, quite
Yeah.
rare. Yeah.
Yeah.
One more chapter. I'm sure my guess is the amount of feedback you get for that chapter is disproportionate. Would be the vaccination chapter in the book, and you note in that discussion, and I should just say for our audience, you're broadly pro-vaccination in there, but you note that the odds of someone being anti-vaccination actually increases with education, which was a bit surprising to me in the sense that this book is predicated on the idea that better information will lead to better decision making. And I suppose education correlates with being better informed.
Yes.
Well, maybe about beer pong at least. I don't know. But let's just stipulate it. Education means better information, but yet better educated people are making scientifically poorly informed choice to not vaccinate their children. So what gives?
I don't know. Oh my God, I wish I understood. So I mean, I think this is like very puzzling in the sense that almost every other health outcome you look at, obesity, heart disease, strokes, like cancer, diabetes, basically any short long-term outcome that you look at, more educated people do better. So more educated people are just like healthier on every dimension. It's like one of the most robust relationships within the field of health economics. Except for this thing, where it seems like, again, like health education seems to correlate with a smaller rate of vaccination, even though this is like clearly a good idea. And it's, it's actually the demographics I think are kind of are mixed in the sense that that there are also pockets of poorly educated people who aren't vaccinated, and so you see sort of this kind of like these kind of two groups or sort of multiple different pockets of who is not vaccinated. And I don't really understand what the issue is. I think that, there are certainly people who believe that vaccines are dangerous and are, going to cause issues. And I've talked to some of those people, and I don't really understand. I still, even after those conversations, have a very poor understanding of kind of what the real issues are. And I think without that, it's like hard to think about why those are cropping up more in more educated people.
So you're an academic economist. You're very active in your field, writing lots of well-regarded papers for an academic audience. So why parenting books? I mean, it takes time out from the publish or perish regime of academic publishing, and while writing 2 New York Times bestsellers is a reward in and of itself, that wouldn't have been, I would suggest, the most obvious outcome when you started this whole process. So what compelled you to say, I'm going to take time out from academic publishing and write these books?
Yeah, I mean, the first book I was really like I don't know, passion project is like too strong a word, but I got pregnant and I was just like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe how frustrating this experience is. And I started kind of doing all of this research like really in the service of my own pregnancy, and just sort of finding myself like basically like every evening and weekend like looking up papers and trying to figure out what was the right prenatal testing, and kind of going through the statistics, and so I think that the book there, the sort of first book, really came out of that. And I why exactly I decided to write it in a book, I'm not sure. I mean, I've always really enjoyed the challenge of explaining these kind of things to people who are not like professional economists. It's part of why I like teaching, and it's it's a kind of writing that I like to do. And so I sort of thought, oh, I'll try to do this a little, and then it kind of got into being more than a little. And I think I didn't think too much at the time about the professional consequences, which was probably a mistake, but okay, such is life. And then I wasn't, did have some pretty significant professional consequences that were not positive, the first book. And then so then I wasn't actually sure about writing a second book, but it's why it took so long. But eventually I kind of realized that in spite of the professional downsides, the sort of social value upside was big, right? So, my most cited paper has 800 citations in Google Scholar. It's about using selection, it's about econometric methodology,
Mm,
and like that's great.
that's
Like
great for that. Yeah,
that's
domain.
like it was like a well cited paper. A lot of people use it for their papers, whatever. But I've sold like, I don't know, 100,000, a bit more than 100,000 of the first book. And so that like the sort of scope of impact that I can have is much different. And although I very much enjoy helping people improve their political economy papers by addressing selection on unobservables, getting to be the privilege of getting people to sort of have a better experience of pregnancy or childbirth or raising their kids, that's like a sort of a different scale of impact. And I think ultimately that was what drew me to writing the second book. Also, I actually really, really like writing these books. Like I just like really enjoy it. And so now I have tenure and I can do the stuff that I like a little bit.
So I mentioned earlier, you and your husband, Jesse Shapiro, both economists. Your parents are two prominent economists, Sharon Oster, Ray Fair. How much of a difference did growing up in a house full of economists make in your upbringing? And do you see any similar effects on your kids? I know this is anecdote because of just you, but yeah.
I mean, I do think that some of the sort of like some of what I try to I think is useful in these books is that I tend to think about things like my parenting or things like outside of my job through the lens of economics,
Mm,
and the kind of like economics of the everyday is very prominent in my world, and I think that is partly because of my childhood. My parents, it's not that they were like coming home to like tell us about economics research, but the ways that they made choices mostly were grounded in kind of basic economics principles.
mm,
And so that the kind of idea that like the answer to like why don't we go grocery shopping is, why do we have our groceries delivered, was like, well, my opportunity cost of time is very high,
mm.
which was the answer I got from my mom. That was like okay, yeah, that's the answer. Like, yeah, of course. Obviously, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. And so I think that did influence, it made me interested in economics and so on. But I think it actually probably influences the book stuff even more than my job.
Mm, mm.
In terms of my own kids, like, I don't think they're that interested in economics. But we do talk about economics a little bit, but not actually that much. And I will say, like, my daughter's like way more interested in like biology kind of stuff than she is in economics. I try to like tell her things about economics research, and it's like, yeah, that's enough. Thanks. It's just like I don't want to hear about this. So we'll see.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on the show. And for all of our listeners, until next week, be well. Thanks for listening. Building Tomorrow is produced by Tess Terrible. If you enjoy Building Tomorrow, please subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about libertarianism, find us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.